afternoon. Good afternoon. There we go. And a nice howdy for the senator from Texas, of course. My name's Neil Bradley. I'm the Executive Vice President and Chief Policy Officer here at the Chamber of Commerce, and it is my distinct honor to kick off this afternoon's program with an important discussion of two elected leaders who have really been at the forefront their entire terms in the Senate, helping advance the U.S. India relationship. And so these gentlemen probably don't need much introduction, but I'm going to give them one anyway. Senator Cornyn from Texas, immediately to my right, is in his fourth term in the U.S. Senate, originally elected in 2002. But this is a capstone of 4 decades of public service as a district judge, the Texas Supreme Court, Texas Attorney General. He served as the number 2 in the Republican leadership in the Senate and currently serves on the Finance, Intelligence, and Judiciary Committees. His junior senator in terms of seniority, in his 3rd term, being elected in 2008, Senator Warner from the great Commonwealth of Virginia, serves as the chair of the Intelligence Committee, is on the Finance Committee, the Banking Committee, Budget and Rules. Of course, he is the former governor of the state of Virginia. These two gentlemen have a lot in common, despite the fact that they're from different parties and come from different parts of the country. But they are both amazing friends to the business community, helping both when they were leadership in their states, but now in Congress, support free enterprise, support the growth of entrepreneurialism and small businesses, helping make America competitive in the world today. They also co-chair the U.S. India Caucus and have provided leadership for what I think we'll learn in a moment is actually the largest caucus in the United States Senate. So join me in welcoming our 2 guests this afternoon. So, Senator Cornyn, you actually were the co-founder of the U.S. Senate India Caucus. What is the caucus? What do you do? Tell us a little bit more about it.
Well, I'm the proud representative of about 30 million Texans, including about 500,000 Indian Americans. And shortly after I got elected to the Senate, I was invited to make a trip to India, my first trip. And then when I returned, a good friend of mine who happened to be one of the founders of the Dallas-Fort Worth Indo-American Chamber said, why don't you consider creating an India caucus in the Senate? So Hillary Clinton was my founding partner in that effort. After she left, Chris Dodd served in that capacity, and then Mark Warner, who's the current chairman and partner in that efforts. But this is a huge, highly educated, entrepreneurial, very successful constituency in my state. And it opened my eyes to the important relationship to the world's largest democracy and the world's oldest democracy. And so that's how it got started.
Senator Warner, I read off your list of committee assignments. I don't know how you have time to sleep. And when you compare it to the work of chairing the Senate Intelligence Committee and the bandwidth that kind of role takes, why was it important for you to take on the role of being co-chair of the Senate India Caucus?
Well, like John, we've got a huge part of the Indian American diaspora that lives in Virginia. When I was governor, all the governors, at that point I was governor 2002 to 2006, were all going to China. I went to China, but I was one of the first governors to lead a large delegation to India. And I think this partnership is the most important partnership our nation has in the 21st century. We've grown this bipartisan caucus to 42 members. That's the largest bipartisan single country caucus in the whole Senate. We've seen with the movement forward on the Quad and a host of other agreements, India's ascension into truly one of the great powers of the world. And I think about this from the intel standpoint. We've got room to go. John and I work a lot on trying to move India up on the list of nations to get better status in terms of our defense relations, but we have very close relations on the intel side. And I was just recently in India, and one senior Indian official, I asked him what India's greatest challenges were, and he said number one was China, number two was China, number three was China. And that is very similar to what John and I are grappling with in our work in the Senate.
There are a lot of initiatives going on right now between the U.S. and India, lots of areas where we're looking to make progress, and I want to dive in on a couple of them. And maybe we can start with ISET. So the U.S. Chamber and U.S. IBC were pleased to host the private sector launch of the initiative on critical and emerging technologies earlier this year. But I think there's a lot of questions about where we see this going and how much progress can be made in this front. Do you have a perspective on, particularly with respect to technology engagement, what the future looks like between the U.S. and India?
Let me start on that one. I think the opportunities are huge. I just was talking with somebody backstage about trying to open up more B2B connections in terms of supply chain. I think we saw with COVID, sourcing of APIs on a pharmaceutical basis. We had a lot of reliance on China and some reliance on India. I think John and I both would concur that the more we could move those out of China into India or elsewhere would be important. My background before I was in the politics was in the wireless world, so I'm kind of a tech nerd. The biggest wake-up call for me in terms of our technology competition with China was Huawei and 5G, where not only was China having the leading player, but in many ways was also setting the rules, regulations, protocols, something that we had always done in the past. The next generation beyond 5G is something called ORAN, Open Radio Access Network. John and I worked together on that when we also did the CHIPS bill. And this is a potentially huge area as we think about trying to, frankly, move to a more software-based wireless communication system, and software-based will feed right into India's strength in terms of software engineers. So my hope is there will be even potential of announcements around ORAN with the Prime Minister's visit next week.
Yeah, I would just add that two things come to mind. One is obviously India and the United States share a commitment to the rule of law. And if you look around the world, there's a lot of entrepreneurial people, but where there's no protection of intellectual property and rule of law where people can enforce contracts and those sorts of things, it's real hard to develop your economy. The second is the rise of China and the threat of President Xi and the aggressive posture he has adopted. We've seen post-COVID, of course, concern about supply chains Mark talked about, but also concern for the lack of transparency in investments made in China out of, I think, paranoid national security concerns by China. So it's harder and harder for fiduciaries and others to know what exactly is going on with their investments in China, which is, and India seems like an obvious alternative.
Is it fair to say this is both a national security and economic security opportunity? Is that how both of you kind of look at the future with respect to India?
Yeah, I think absolutely. Certainly from an economic standpoint, and we're already doing a lot of co-production of defense articles and the like. And obviously, India doesn't want to just buy our stuff. They want to be able to build it too, but they will do it in partnership with us. One of the things that we, Mark can speak for himself, but I think was a little bit disappointing, is when Russia invaded Ukraine, India took a pass. And if you look historically at the relationship between those two, it's not because of common ideology or economic systems. It's because of the Indian dependency on Russian weaponry. So they're coming our way, as Mark said, and it can't happen fast enough, but you can't hit the reset button and redo 50 years of history overnight.
Let me follow on John on that. I think one of the things, and John and I work very, very closely together on the Intel Committee. I think we are redefining national security. National security is, particularly vis-a-vis China, is much more than tanks and guns and ships and planes. It is who actually wins the battle for wireless communication. It is who first gets there in quantum computing. I met this morning with a group of folks on synthetic biology, advanced energy. We had a session, John and I, recently on small modular nuclear. Our collaboration with India, which has got such technology expertise in India and candidly in the Indian American diaspora, is a huge, huge asset that we have to take advantage of. The Quad is one point, and I hope the Quad continues to look, and that's why I think what you guys are doing at USIBC and at the Chamber in terms of ISET is so important. All these domains, technology domains, are national security domains as well. Let me also add what John mentioned at the end. I mean, I just came back from India in February. I've been to India many, many times. And always in the past, India was viewed, and I think the Indian leadership itself viewed themselves as an aspiring nation. My last visit, I felt like India's time has arrived. And I saw this level of confidence from the Prime Minister, senior government officials, senior business officials, even doing the kind of proverbial visit to the large slum in Mumbai where we were looking at new kind of sanitary issues. There was a huge optimism here. And I want to echo what John said, and we've had some very candid conversations with the ambassador and others about the fact that as India has arrived as a truly great, one of the most important nations in the world, they can no longer take a pass on some of these things like the moral pass, frankly, on not calling out Putin's aggression. And I heard, again, a lot of the issues that John heard as well. We go back to the Pakistan war, the 70s war, and where do we get supply. But one leading official, I won't call out his name, but he said this in many ways is generational. There's nobody under 40 that doesn't think the long-term interests of India are more aligned with the United States. And he also pointed out, he said he did not know a single Indian citizen that was aspiring to get a visa to move to Russia or move to China. And I think people vote with their feet. And I think as long as we keep this collaboration going, and John and I and others can continue to build a relationship on the Hill, this potential is huge.
We'll leave aside making it easier for those who want to vote with their feet to come to the U.S. for another day. But we have an upcoming state visit, an address to Congress. I'm curious what each of you are hoping to see and what you hope comes out of those events and the dialogue that can occur when the Prime Minister's here with you all, when he's across the street at the White House. Senator Cornyn?
Well, I hope we'll see an acceleration of that, India and the United States realigning. Again, we've talked about history, and you can't go back and do a redo of history, but we can recognize that the current threats are real. And I remember my last trip to Delhi in November of 2021. I was visiting with one of the senior officials in India, and I said, we're really concerned about what the PRC may do in Taiwan. And he said, Senator, we don't have a Taiwan problem, we have a China problem. And so I think the concerns that India understandably has with the border war going on with China, and just their recognition that that they would benefit from opening up their economy to more U.S. investment and working alongside of us, that I think this visit is a very important symbol of our growing more closely together. Obviously, India wants to maintain their strategic independence, and they will do that because they always have, but I think it's a positive sign.
Senator Warder, do you have hopes and expectations?
I would add, I think one of the things that again, John referenced, that was Indian officials pointed out to me, is that China has more troops based provocatively on the Indian border, then Russia has troops invading on Ukraine. So this point that mentioned it's not a Taiwan problem, it is a China problem, and the Indians recognize that. I agree with John. I would really hope in some of these technology domains, and we've seen, I think ISET's a good move, I think the Quad's a good move, but I also say, and I say this with appropriate respect, not to try to stick my nose in internal Indian affairs, but as a great nation, as a great democracy, I hope we will hear from the Prime Minister, because he is so popular, a recommitment to rule of law, a recommitment to a political process that remains open. I've been troubled by some of the actions that I think that were a bit over the top in terms of some of the actions taken towards Congress Party leaders. I heard privately concerns in terms of making sure the very vibrant free press in India stays that vibrant and stirring the pot as it does. So I hope we'll get a commitment, a recommitment there, because I think that is, again, one of the great strengths of India, as we always mention, the world's biggest democracy and oldest democracy. Both of our nations need to make sure we maintain those commitments.
Some very important things that government can do, rule of law, the national security aspects. But today we also have a lot of CEOs and business leaders in the audience who I think would benefit greatly from your insights about what the business community can and should be doing to foster greater U.S.-India engagement, cooperation, and economic opportunity. And since we let Senator Cornyn go first at the end, we'll let Senator Warner finish up. But
well, I would say we need to do more of this. I mean, if you look at the speakers you've had since last night until the end of the day today, this is a who's who, at least of this administration. At the cabinet level, I know you got Ann Newberg, you had Amos Hochstein. You've got the right players in the room, and I think that's important, that we in Congress are listening and the administration is listening, number one. Number two, I think we've always benefited from a lot of Indian students coming here, learning here, many staying here. I think businesses we as Americans need to be sending more students over to study in India. So we get this more cross-cultural affinity. And I think there's been actions by some of the successful Indian American diaspora to actually help sponsor more of that. I think more of this cross-collaboration where it's not just Indians coming here, but Americans going to India. It is a very different place than it was 25 years ago. And I think, again, because I think the challenge on China is not going to go away. Lord knows we're not hoping that we would have the kind of decoupling that we had with Russia. But if you don't have a plan B in place, vis-a-vis Taiwan, or vis-a-vis if she starts sending offensive weapons into Russia, then you are being slightly irresponsible to your shareholders and customers, and that plan B ought to include India.
Senator Cornyn, last word.
Well, I agree with what Mark said. This is a very uncertain world we're living in, and Mark and I did a what he calls a road show with the Business Roundtable recently, where all of these CEOs were read in to a classified briefing by the Director of National Intelligence, the Deputy Director of the CIA, and others. And basically, what they told them is what we hear almost on a daily basis as members of the Intelligence Committee about all the challenges that face our country and the world. And of course, Ukraine was a reminder, as Bob Gates, not Bill Gates, Bob Gates said our long holiday from history is over. So this can not only have national security implications, but obviously economic implications go along with that. But one of the things that the United States has always done best is that our economy has supported our ability to protect ourselves as a nation and to help keep the peace in the world. And there is no substitute for American leadership. So we need to keep leaning forward, but continue to grow our economy in a way that can support our defense and prevention of outbreaks of conflicts around the world that will be very disruptive and very dangerous for our country.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there, but another great thing that you two now have in common together is that you've helped educate an entire room full of people on some really important topics and illustrated the importance of the bipartisan leadership that you provide in this critical part of the world. And I want everyone to join me in thanking Senator Warner and Senator Cornyn for all their great leadership.